part of the expectation that you be here, that you participate. So I encourage you to come. If you've got questions or just whatever you might have about our ministry and about the ministry together, I want you to come and participate in that. Several things going on, again, with Sunrise City. We're going to have a united service, again, a service where we unite both churches together for worship. We're going to be doing that October the 6th, Sunday, October the 6th at 9:30. So we'll meet during their time, their normal service time, and then immediately following that, we'll go to small groups at 10:45. So we're just kind of flip-flopping our schedule so we can kind of meet and worship together with them. So just make that change on your calendar to be sure that you're there, okay? Hebrews chapter 11, we've been talking about faith and what faith looks like and what it sounds like and what it produces. And we've been through a lot of different illustrations that the writer provides us, primarily walking us through the key figures of the Old Testament. And all these particular figures are asked to do different things by God. And it doesn't mean you and I are going to be asked the same exact things. You're not being asked to build an ark like Noah was building an ark. You're not being asked at this point to sacrifice your son like Abraham did. But it still qualitatively has to do with the fact that our God has a right to ask anything of us. He owns it all, okay? He owns us. He's brought us into relationship with his son, Jesus. We have said, Jesus, you are Lord. Lordship means you're in charge. It means whatever you say and whatever you direct, that's what I'm going to do. And for the most part, whenever he speaks and his word is obeyed, it requires faith to obey. Even understanding it, it requires faith to actually follow through and do what God says. Today we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 20. We're going to go back to verse 23, actually verse 23. And we're going to look at the man named Moses. Moses is the word, his name means out of the water. And this is the story of Moses, who is conceived during a particular time in which Israel has been residing in Egypt for around 400 years. They ended up there because of Joseph. Joseph was Jacob's son. He was Jacob's son. He had a particular call in his life that eventually brought him to second in command of all of Egypt. Even though he was mistreated, he was abused in many ways by his brothers, he ends up to bring favor to the land of Egypt and actually bring Egypt through a time of famine. All of the Israelites at the time, all 70 of them, make their way down into Egypt. And now for around 400 years, they've been having babies and developing families, and now they're in the millions, okay? And God begins to actually, since it's time to actually bring his people out of Egypt into the land of promise that was given and promised to Abraham. The individual that he uses is a person named Moses. Moses has a particular life. He's given life, but he's born at a time in which the babies are viewed negatively by the Egyptians that are ruling and reigning at the time. And so the command is that if boys are born to the Israelites, they're to be thrown into the Nile. A terrible particular decree that was made by the Pharaoh. And so this particular birth of Moses is significant because he is spared. A lot of baby boys were not spared. He was spared by his parents. So I want you to read with me as I read verse 23. By faith, Moses, after he was born, he was hidden by his parents for 3 months because they saw that the child was beautiful and they didn't fear the king's edict. Verse 24, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and chose to suffer with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin. For he considered reproach for the sake of Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since he was looking ahead to the reward. Moses is going to illustrate that by faith, you and I are to make a choice specifically for the reward. We are to begin to highly value and, in fact, aspire to what is the heavenly reward. And that heavenly reward is to so fill our minds and our desires and our thoughts and our aspirations that it makes essentially everything this world has to offer with respect to its entertainment, with respect to its purpose, its values, is basically trash compared to the reward that is set out for those who pursue God and experience the reward by faith. And so by faith, from the very beginning of his life and to the very end, he is going to represent what it is to say yes to God and his kingdom and yes to his world and no to everything else. And this is the narrative. By faith, he was born. He was hidden by his parents for 3 months. It says when they saw the child was beautiful. Every baby's beautiful in its own way. The word here really has to do with favor. They saw, in a sense, something upon him that told them that something was unique about him, not just simply that they would care for him as their son, but they were going to risk their lives and risk, essentially, the response of the Pharaoh and the edict to actually keep him alive, to spare him. It's an awareness they had. Everybody loves their child and feels like their child's going to be great and significant. We all feel like, who knows what this baby's going to accomplish? But they understood in their way, and God making them aware, this baby has purpose. This baby is going to do something and be used of me, God would say, in a particular way. So they spare him. They put him in this little basket in the bulrushes. They put him strategically out in a place where they know essentially the princess of the Pharaoh, the daughter of the Pharaoh, bathes regularly. She goes to bathe down to the Nile, sees this little basket, opens it up, hears the cry. She's done. It's hers. And then she ultimately takes Moses into her life, and actually, in a miraculous way, Moses' mom becomes essentially a mom to the baby, assisting her in taking care of the baby, which is pretty amazing. So it says, verse 24, by faith Moses, when he was grown up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Instead, he chose to suffer with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin. Moses grows up in the finery of Egypt. I mean, the complete finery. Egypt was the superpower of the day. It was the science center of the day. It was the architectural center of the day. It was the wealth center of the day. It was the commerce center of the day. And Moses had every opportunity to experience everything that the Pharaoh life and the king's life and the elite's life had to experience. He was in position to actually know, and other places in Scripture say he actually knew the wisdom of and studied the wisdom of Egypt. He knew the language, he knew the history, he knew ultimately what they knew, and he was raised on the finest of things. But it says when he had grown up, something happened. It's the idea, something happened, his identity. He became aware not of what he could do and what he could know, he became aware of his essential identity as a Hebrew. He began to know that he was part of God's people. He was part of the promise of God's people. And it says he specifically refused in verse 24 to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He said, I no longer want my identity to be basically related to the elite of Egypt. I am going to take my place as now a descendant or as a man, essentially, of God, of Israel, of God's people. And you see how this illustration plays out with Moses. I think it's very similar because we're going to look at the journey we make as believers when we confess our faith and our allegiance to Jesus Christ. We become specifically connected to a covenantal Lord, a new covenant, Lord of a new covenant who has new promises and better experiences and better indwelling and better forgiveness, which we've made through all of the book of Hebrews. And we are required to respond to the fact that we are no longer citizens of this world. We operate in this world, but our citizenry is in heaven. We are kingdom people. We belong to a kingdom that is now, but not yet. And by faith, we begin to make choices that begin to disconnect us from ultimately the values of the world in itself and begin to connect ourselves fully with the kingdom. So it says when he had grown, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He renounced all the favor, the legacy. Oh, by the way, if a prince has you as their child, well, then that makes you a princess, that puts you in line of royalty. He traded all of that. He traded all the favor. He traded all the track of advancement. He traded all the favor of wealth and influence and power. He traded it all for what? He chose to suffer. It says he chose to suffer with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin. In fact, he considered it a reproach for the sake of Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since he was looking ahead to the reward. You say, that doesn't make any sense to me. He traded all the wealth and the prosperity and everything having to do with Egypt to suffer. Now, the way and means he did that, he acted out. He tried to speak and act in behalf of an abuse that was taking place between an Egyptian soldier and some of the Hebrew people. He tried to intervene and try to bring about some sense of separation between this conflict. And getting into the middle of that, he was equipped to exert power over the soldier, and he killed the soldier. In other words, his way of saying, this is how I'm going to help this come about. There's an injustice going on here between the people of God who are suffering and the great exaggerated wealth and power and influence of Egypt. I'm going to move into the middle here, and I'm going to solve this. And how am I going to solve it? I'm going to solve it by killing this soldier. And he did, and he buried him, but little by little it became known that in fact he had done that. And Pharaoh found out about it, and he had to flee for his life. He fully respected He fully respected Pharaoh and the power he exerted, and he knew ultimately, I could not stay here in this place because he's going to kill me. But his actions demonstrated a commitment to suffer and to intervene on the behalf of God's people. But God didn't step in and just give him like an army behind him to actually bring it about. In fact, he left and he went off into the wilderness for 40 years. He went off into another place where he served as a shepherd, where he just took care of sheep and livestock. So this guy who was loaded to the teeth with everything that Egypt had to offer, he chose to intervene and chose to embrace the suffering that was taking place in his kinship, in his kin with respect to the Israeli people. And that particular event sent him off in the desert where he spent 40 years essentially taking care of animals. But he got married, he had children, he lived the quiet kind of Bedouin life that he had experienced. Verse 27 says, by faith, he left Egypt behind. I want you to look here because we're going to see 5 different effects of him making the choice to leave behind everything that Egypt has to offer and to move forward to actually embrace the reward of God. And I want you to see 5 effects, 5 ways that he was affected, others were affected by his single choice to say, I'm not going to embrace everything that the world offers, the values of the world and its way of advancement and prosperity and wealth and paganism and godless values. I'm not going to embrace that. I'm going to obey God. I'm going to follow. I'm going to embrace ultimately the covenant and the promises that have been given to our people in God. And the first one here, it says, by faith he left Egypt behind. Now, that is the first choice we make together as believers and followers of Jesus. We leave the world behind. John, the gospel would say, we are in the world, but we are not of it. We are in the world, but we are not of it. We operate in the world in the sense of operating as human beings do, and we seek to do what we do in a way that brings glory to Jesus Christ. But we do not buy into the system of the world. He left the world behind, not being afraid of the king's anger. For Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. The first effect of his commitment to join the people of God was to leave Egypt behind. It's to leave Egypt behind. I grew up in student ministry, and this was a constant theme for kids and constant theme for students because kids were always in the throw of it, right? They're in the mix of just, you're trying to raise them in the things of the Lord as their kids, and we're trying to say, this is how we as a Christian family operate, and this is how we believe, and this is why we go to church, and this is what we practice, and this is what we profess. And our kids are going somewhere else, and they're interacting with other kids, and they're interacting with other ball teams and other clubs and group, and they begin to be exposed to other values with kids who don't go to church, and they don't believe in Jesus like the kids do. They don't, and so we have to admonish them. And the youth pastor that I was at one point is always saying, do not let the world put you into its mold, Romans 12, chapter 1. Don't let it kind of assimilate you. You need to actually be committed and put yourself into the mold of following Jesus Christ. And we say that, but we kind of know they're going to grow up and they're going to hit 18, 19, and then they're going to do what they're going to do. And the fact of the matter, the statistic that still holds true for Southern Baptists is when kids graduate from Southern Baptist churches, only 5% will continue on with church. So in other words, you're like, okay, then we don't have to say that anymore because they're gone, right? Student ministry, it was good for student ministry, but now everybody who's in church right now is pretty committed, so we really don't have to deal with this idea of the world and the flesh and the temptation anymore because that whole generation, 2 generations are gone. Well, it should cause us to say, what happened? It should cause us to say, what happened? What were we doing well that we weren't doing as well as we should? We were doing a lot well, but apparently we weren't doing perhaps the main thing well, because your kids, your grandkids, you can just go through in your mind and just say, are they following Jesus? Are they in love with Jesus? Are they disciples of Christ? Are they actually following him? Are they participating not in church for going to church's sake? Are they actually following Jesus and connected to a group of believers who are part of their ongoing discipleship work? One of the things that may have happened is as individuals, and youth can see it all, young people can tell whether or not we're for real on Jesus, or whether or not we're living with one foot in the world and one foot in Christ. Kids know the difference when we say you need to be totally committed to Jesus, but they also know we're pretty busy with the world stuff. And over time, because the majority of the world doesn't believe, they begin to realize, my parents and my family and Christians are a minority. I want to be popular. I don't want to be the weird kid. And they begin to actually say, I'm going to embrace the values of the world so that I can fit in, so I can get a job, so I can be happy, so I can have friends. The first thing he had to say was, I'm not going to live in Egypt and in the promised land. I can't remain here in Egypt. I got to leave. I've got to go. I've got to get out of this world. I've got to get out of the system. I've got to make a decision that I'm not going to let the world system actually characterize my life. So the first thing he did is he left Egypt behind. Now, he made his way back to Egypt. Did he do it of his own free will? Absolutely not. He was okay being out of Egypt. He's in the country. He's enjoying God's country. He's taking care of God's animals. He's got a wife. He's got a family. It's all quiet. It's all peaceful. There's nothing but basically a little bit of grass, a little bit of water. You feed them. You wake up during the day when the sun comes up. You go to bed when the sun comes down. It's a good life. Until you walking through the wilderness and you see a bush on fire. That's not supposed to be on fire. You say, I've never seen that before. Bushes just don't normally ignite themselves. I got to go see what this is. And this voice comes out of the bush and says, Moses, take off your shoes. You're on holy ground. I'm going to send you back to Egypt, not to embrace Egypt. I'm going to send you back to Egypt to actually rescue my people cooperatively, corporately out of Israel, out of Egypt. And that's what he did. He wasn't all for it. He didn't think he was the right guy. Didn't think he had all the equipment for it. Didn't think he was the courageous faith one. But by faith, he followed God, took his rod, took his staff, took his cloak, took what God gave him, and went back to Egypt and began to make that repetitive statement of, let my people go. And he said it 9 times, and God brought great curses and great destruction on the land of Israel, on the land of Egypt. He completely destroyed almost the entire commerce, the whole workings of Egypt. God did to begin to cause an awareness that he was the one true God, but also begin to witness to the people of Israel that, in fact, their God had come to rescue them and that Moses was the spokesman. The 10th plague, verse 28, says, by faith he instituted the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch the Israelites. He not only left Egypt, that in and of itself didn't make him a righteous person. It's by faith he did that. What actually made him a righteous person, by faith he institutes the Passover. He recognizes who God is, and God basically says to both the Israelites and to the Egyptians, I am going to come at a particular time in the evening, and a destroyer is going to move across the land. And the only individuals who are going to be spared, the firstborn, are going to be spared only if you will take the blood of a lamb, an unblemished lamb, a year-old lamb, and you take that blood and you put it on the doorpost and the lintel of your doorway. The destroyer will pass over you. The Egyptians heard the word, the Israelites heard the word, only the Israelites obeyed. By faith, he put forward a moment of demarcation between the people of Egypt and the people of a new covenant and a new promise. The difference in that place was how they were going to relate to God, whether they were going to obey his word, whether they were going to accept ultimately the grace and the mercy he displayed in actually providing a blood sacrifice by which when the destroyer passed over, they didn't have death in that home other than the lamb itself. Well, something died in that home. It was the lamb. And the destroyer passes over, and the firstborn of cattle and sheep and oxen and people died. And a wailing began to rise throughout the land of Egypt. The difference between the people of faith, Israelites, and the people of the world in unbelief was centered around God said, I'm bringing judgment on all of you. Do you understand that? I'm bringing judgment on Israelites. I'm bringing judgment on Egyptians. I'm bringing judgment on this land. The firstborn are going to die throughout the land. Do you understand? There isn't one like good person, bad person, Jews are good, Egyptians are bad. Everybody's lost. Everybody's under the judgment of God. The difference, God gave the same message of mercy and grace to both the Egyptians and the Israelites, and only the Israelites believed. And when the destroyer went across, the Israelites were spared. That's our story, believers. That's what takes us out of the world. We have a mindset to leave the world, but ultimately it's because a death has taken place on our behalf. We want to leave the world and its influences, but ultimately, what is it that bonds us to God? What is it that actually moves us into his covenant? It's the blood sacrifice of Jesus Christ. It's the recognition that every one of us deserve to be judged, and yet God in his mercy provided a way through Jesus Christ, his one and only Son, that he died and buried, and if they would trust him exclusively and unitedly in our minds together, that we will be saved, the justice will not fall on us, but that in fact it will fall on someone else. And Jesus is that lamb. He is that lamb sacrifice. So Moses particularly, he leaves Egypt. He left it behind, but he also embraced something in the midst of it. He understood this world is marked for judgment, and the only good news, really, the only way escape from the judgment that this world as individuals deserves is in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it's the shed blood of Christ. Number 3, verse 29, it says, by faith they crossed the Red Sea as though they were on dry land. When the Egyptians attempted to do this, it didn't work out. They were drowned, is the translation. He leaves Egypt. God brings him back into Egypt to say, let my people go. 10 plagues happen. They have this particular plague that is dramatically terrible and separative between Egypt and the Jewish people. It helps Pharaoh to come to a conclusion enough that he is able to let them go and send them on their way. They make their way out of Egypt, on their way to the land of promise. They're really going to a meeting place with God in the Mount Moriah, but they're headed to the promised land, the land of promise, and they are doing fine. God leads them on a particular journey that requires them to cross water. There's millions of them. And in the time it takes for them to exit the land of Egypt and make this massive move of people to water, Pharaoh changes his mind and his whole disposition of hatred just rises back up. And the people of Israel are now on one side of the water with the Egyptians chasing them from behind. They've got water on one side, they've got a wilderness on the other side which doesn't offer any hope, and they've got this water that they cannot pass and cross over without drowning. And God says, Moses, take your staff, take your rod, strike the water. He puts it in the water, and the Red Sea just parts, and the children of Israel make their way across on dry ground. Figure that one out. And we know it was a serious miracle. It wasn't like, we want to put you on dry ground so you don't get your feet wet. It's only like 6 or 7 inches of water. You can't see the Egyptians drowning in 6 or 7 inches of water. It was a lot more than 6 or 7 inches of water. The water was piled up on one side, the scripture says, and the Israelites crossed over, and they made their way across. And God provided a way for them to escape the annihilation that was on the mind of the Egyptians. God stepped forward to prove he's not just the one who can work all kinds of power in judgment, but that he can do something incredibly benevolent too in doing the impossible, of providing a path through the Red Sea. And it would always be an illustration for Israel that whatever it is you face, whatever it is you can't cross, whatever the pressure is behind you, around, or beside you, if the front seems blocked and you can't cross, you're going to have to wait. You're going to have to trust God to make a way forward. He would say a path. The psalmist would say, he would make a path through the water. And he would say, this is a path for believers. This is a path for the children of Israel. It's a path for the children of Israel of life. You try to cross that path in your own flesh, Egyptians. You get 2/3 away, and God just brings the water onto you, and you drowned. In other words, the way of mercy and provision and refuge of God was the way of death for Egyptians. Crazy that they would just look at that and say, yeah, I know we're looking at a crazy miracle, but we're still going to kill him. Yeah, the God who parted the water and killed our firstborn, and destroyed our lands, livestock, and destroyed all of our commerce, and destroyed and made a mockery of all of our godless theology, we're going after him no matter what. And God brought the water up and saw the chariot's wheels come off and saw the individuals start to float on the surface, and all the metal and all the efforts to destroy the children of God were defeated. And great songs would be sung on the other side. You'd get on the other side. Can you imagine being the children of Israel on the other side of the Red Sea, looking back at what you had to cross, thinking that was our death, we were over, and yet Moses led us to trust God, and we walked across on dry land. So Moses' faith, his choice to leave Egypt and to begin to separate himself from Egypt as a place of future and hope and power and prosperity, put him a place where he would begin to be the influencer to help God's people see what God would do for them, and ultimately how he would provide and how he would spare them. They would obey him and follow him and trust him, even in some of these crazy, impossible moments. He crossed the Red Sea on dry land. When the Egyptians attempted to do this, they were drowned. In other words, Moses got to lead them to experience things they could not do on their own. He got to lead them to experience things the Egyptians could not experience and make happen. God began to do things that, in fact, they thought impossible. They began to cry. They began to whine on one side of the Red Sea, saying, Moses, did you bring us out here to die? Moses said, no. And he crossed they put the Red Sea, it parted, and they crossed. So his act of faith and his choice caused him to leave Egypt behind. He persevered. By faith, he instituted the Passover to bring about, by faith, a means by which the children of Israel, God's people, would relate to their God through this sacrificial system, this innocent life poured out that would ultimately be fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And then verse 29, by faith they crossed the Red Sea. They were able to experience things in God's provision and protection. Now, being God's people and being obedient to God, first of all and foremost, and not being wishy-washy with one foot in the world and one foot in Egypt, puts you in a place where you get to walk where you could never walk before. But you have to choose who you're going to trust. You have to choose who you're going to believe. If you live in two worlds, and I think the illustration here of the Red Sea is very potent, because you can see the Israelites making it all the way across on dry ground. You can see another group of people doing the very same journey, and yet it's a means by which they perish. So what am I saying here? I'm saying the choice. Everybody in life has obstacles. Everybody in life has Red Sea moments. Everybody in life has things that face them up that they cannot defeat. Everybody in life has that. The difference for the people of God is we look at obstacles differently. We look at blocked walls. We look at gated fences. We look at the water itself, and we say, Jesus, or we say, God particularly, are we going there? There's no way we're going to get across, and you brought us out here, and we're going to fail, or we're going to fall, or we're going to experience harm. And God in his mercy says, no, I've got a provision for you, and he's the one who makes the way. So by faith, Moses speaks for this God. They all get to experience it. Verse 38, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after being marched around by the Israelites for 7 days. Wow, we made a jump here from Moses to his second in command, Joshua. Okay, but Joshua's been watching the man Moses. He's been interacting with the man Moses. He's been following Moses when Moses goes in and out of the tabernacle to talk to God, and he comes out with his face all really weird and glowing, and everybody's like, please don't look at us. It's strange to see your face glowing, because he was in the presence of God. And the Hebrew is that Moses would fellowship with God nose to nose. We translate it face to face because it's a little too close to be nose to nose, but literally it's nose to nose. Moses is fellowshipping with God nose to nose, and Joshua is just sitting outside, just close to this tabernacle, and he's hearing what's going on in the conversation in the tabernacle, and he's watching this man Moses interact with the people, and he's gaining, he's growing in faith. And so you have Moses as a man of faith having mentored this man Joshua, who eventually, upon Moses' death, Joshua becomes the one who's in control, and God puts his mantle, so to speak, his hand, his power, the power that was on Moses, he puts it on Joshua. And now Joshua's got to decide, am I going to do things the world's way, or am I going to do things God's way? And we're going to take on Jericho. It's this big impregnable city. How are we going to take it? Are we going to take it from the front? Are we going to build some lifts? Are we going to build some ropes and hooks? And are we going to build, what are we going to do? Are we going to try to just overwhelm it? What are we going to do? And God says, yes, you are going to take the city. You're going to walk around it 7 times. It's not going to make a lot of strategic sense. You're not going to find it in any war manual. This is how you take a city. You walk it to death. The only place I've ever seen this particular strategy observed. I've never seen it in modern warfare. Just walk around the city 7 times, and it'll just come and be yours at the end. So the trumpeters, the Levites, the people, the worship team just make their way 1 time every day for 6 days. On the 7th day, they go 7 times around the city. They shout, and the walls just fall inward. Who gets the glory for that victory? God gets the glory. You say, God, that doesn't make sense to me. That I would like to be able to transfer that moment to other people so they can beat up other cities. That sounds kind of singular. And it was God just simply getting clear. I'm the one who brings victory. You have victory because of my arm, not yours. But it took faith for everybody to look at that big city and just keep walking around and saying, I don't know if there's anybody up there who shoots bow and arrow, but they really could have quite an opportunity and a time here. Because they could go to any bulwark, whichever corner of that city, and just shoot their daylights out of anybody. We're just walking around. And I would be just kind of like being sure there was a head right here. I'd talk to the guy and say, yeah, what's going on? What's going on? I make sure his head is between me and the wall. By faith, the walls of Jericho came down after being marched. Moses is going to illustrate for us, when we leave Egypt, we leave Egypt's thinking. We leave Egypt's methods. We leave Egypt's rationales. We leave Egypt's understanding of what ought to be done and what doesn't make sense. We leave the privilege of being in the in crowd, in the in think of what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. We embrace looking silly. because we did it God's way. And he's the one who gets the victory. And somehow God does the ridiculous sometimes, specifically for that purpose, so you know this wasn't in an Egyptian book. Yeah, we learned this from the Pharaoh. This is how he kind of took out all the other people. He got his people to just circle the city, and it shook the ground, and it destabilized the foundation, and it just came down. No, that's never going to work. You're just going to walk one time around, and you're going to have people blowing horns and trumpets and whatever, and that's not going to do a thing against rock unless God says it's going to do something. See, Moses leaves behind. He teaches us about that transition. He reestablishes our connection. He establishes our connection with God through the blood in Jesus. In that way, he, by faith, demonstrates that even God can bring about a path for us when there is no path, and that God ultimately will face the obstacles that we face, and we must face them with faith. And we can describe them, we can identify them, we can break them all down, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. It's God, what do you want to do here? What is your plan to bring about a victory in my life? What's your plan to bring about a victory in my marriage, in my family, in my kids? What's your plan? Because that is too big for me. And if he says you walk around that person, you walk around that decision 7 times and you pray over him, you start walking. You do what he says, no matter how ridiculous it may seem to your mind, our Egyptian impacted mind. We say that this doesn't make any sense on the level of the world, and yet it makes sense with God. Lastly, verse 31, by faith Rahab the prostitute welcomed the spies in peace and didn't perish with those who disobeyed. Rahab the prostitute. Why is she even here? Why we have someone of such ill repute making the faith great? Rahab is an individual who lives in Jericho, who is living, she has a home that is actually situated on the wall of Jericho. Rahab comes to faith in Yahweh God. How does she come to faith in Yahweh God? She hears what God's been doing through the people of Israel under the leadership of Moses. She gets the word that this is what Moses has accomplished. He took out this king, and they took out this king, and God did this through this man Moses. God is doing something great that is really a people who come from the south out of Egypt. God is actually destroying those who will not surrender to him. So she hears the narrative about the work that God's doing through the children of Israel, having been led by Moses, who is walking by faith. It's his testimony that brings her to an understanding that I believe Yahweh God. I believe you're going to take us over. We're all shaking in our boots. The actual report of what God's accomplished is bringing fear to us. A lot of us are just afraid, but we're not going to submit. And Rahab, in her mind, meeting the spies who were there to check out the city, says, I believe your God is who he says he is. He is the one true and living God. And I'm falling on his mercy. I'm saying, when you come to do what your God has equipped you and empowered you to do over the city, I want to come under his mercy. I want to come under his grace. So when the 7 walks around the city happen on the 7th day, and the walls fall in, and all of Joshua and the military goes in and takes over the city, they say ultimately, only people who are going to survive are the people who are in your house. Put this little red cord, this scarlet cord outside the window, and we will not destroy it. And it's an illustration of her coming underneath the mercy and the grace of God by faith when judgment was falling on her city. Lot didn't do anything but just simply panic and fear and would not believe. She said, no, I'm making a refuge for my home and my family. We're going to trust Yahweh God, a merciful God. So Rahab the prostitute, let me see if I got this right. This is a lady who, if it's translated, sometimes the word prostitute can mean innkeeper. I think that's a way of dressing it up. Other context, no, it means what it is. She is a professional sinner before a Yahweh God. And yet she is the one who turns to God and cries for his mercy and receives it for all her family and everyone in her household. Because of the red scarlet thread that's dropping out of her window, she is spared. Do you know what Rahab is also known for? Rahab is known to be in the lineage of Jesus Christ. She is one of only 4 women who are mentioned in Jesus Christ's genealogy. The prostitute makes the lineage of Jesus. She marries an Israelite, finally, right? Life of a lot of men, a lot of sin. God, by his mercy, spares her. She actually marries an Israelite, and it puts her, happens, right? Happens. God in his providence puts her with the individual, the man who is actually directly in line, going to be directly in line with Jesus Christ. Now, if that isn't God's mercy and his sovereign providential will, I don't know what. And it happened because one guy decided, I'm leaving Egypt. I'm leaving Egypt. I'm not going to take the pleasures. I know what Egypt has to offer. I have seen it. I've experienced it. I'm part of it. I'm leaving it behind for the reward of God going forward. And the scripture says very interestingly, it says he chose to suffer with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin. He considered, verse 26 of 11, reproach for the sake of Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. Well, you look back in the narrative, we don't see any reference to Christ. But we do see reference, in a sense, veiled reference to the Messiah, the Christos. He's ultimately saying there is going to come a sacrifice, there's going to come a leader, there's going to come a prophet that is going to ultimately fulfill the prophecies that I'm aware of, Moses would say of, and ultimately the prophecies to come. There is something greater than this ahead. And it's worthy setting it all aside and focusing on the kingdom of God, focus on the reward ahead. So by faith, one guy's choice brings about just a lot of effects that glorify the Lord. You think, I don't think my life could ever be that significant. I don't think my life could ever be that significant, and none of us are called to live Moses' life. But there was a saying I grew up with in college and in seminary that would show up around mission conferences, and it was D.L. Moody. He says this, quote, "The world has yet to see or know or to observe a man or woman fully devoted to Jesus Christ." Now that's D.L. Moody. D.L. Moody got used by God to speak to millions about the gospel. Millions came to Christ, Jesus, through the ministry and the preaching of D.L. Moody. And he's just simply saying, it's not even on the scale. He's saying, I'm not even that person. I'm as devoted as I feel like I know how to be in some ways, and yet I know I'm not fully devoted to Jesus Christ. Help me, Jesus, be that. I know there's closets and space that doesn't belong to you yet. I know there's commitments that need to be made, sacrifices. I know choices. I still have a foot in Egypt and a foot in the promised land. There's still choices that I would have to make to really be devoted to you fully, and I'm not sure yet whether or not you will take care of me or whether you'll provide for me, or whether you'll protect me, or whether you'll actually cover me from the death angel. Maybe I'm not completely sure yet to trust you to do that. And D.L. Moody is like, yeah, think about it. Think about you and me and our commitment to Jesus Christ and to his faithfulness. Times in worship where we sing these great songs about God's faithful. There is nothing too hard. There's nothing too difficult. God, I will say, yes, you are high, you are exalted. We will exalt the greatness of our God and the victory of the cross and the resurrection power and now the ascended beauty and splendor of Jesus seated at the right hand of the Father. And we focus on it and we stare and we dwell upon it. I don't know if you're like me, we dwell upon it, and I'm like, Jesus, you are so great. Why is it the pebbles in my life keep tripping me up? when you are so great? And I realize maybe I'm trying to journey in Egypt's thinking. Maybe it's intertwined with my new covenant thinking, but I'm still reaching back into some resources and some wells that are diluting, contaminating